There are moments in the corporate world where you can actually hear the exact second a company destroys itself. For Ethelgard Tech, that second happened on a Tuesday morning at exactly 10 o'clock. I was sitting in the main executive conference room on the 14th floor. The air was cold, the mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine, and the silence was heavy. Across from me sat Austin Croft. Austin was 32 years old, wore a $3,000 suit he bought with his father's money, and smelled heavily of expensive cologne and unearned confidence. He was the newly appointed Chief Operating Officer, a position handed to him by his aging father, our CEO, just 3 weeks prior. Without saying a single word of greeting, Austin slid a thin white folder across the glass table. It came to a stop right in front of my hands. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I could read the bold letters at the top of the first page. Notice of separation. There was no human resources representative in the room. There was no legal counsel. Austin had bypassed all standard corporate protocols because he wanted to handle this personally. He wanted the thrill of the power trip. "Open it, Alyssa," he said, leaning back in his leather chair and crossing his arms. "My name is Alyssa Cordell. For the past 7 years, I have served as the Chief Technology Architect and Lead System Developer for Ethelgard Tech. I am 38 years old. I didn't get this office through family connections or golf course handshakes. I got here by spending 80-hour weeks building the literal foundation of this company from the ground up." I looked up from the folder and met his eyes. "What is this, Austin?" I asked. My voice was completely flat, calm, and controlled. "I have learned that in rooms like this, emotion is a weakness." Austin sneered. It was a small, ugly smirk that showed exactly how much he underestimated me. "It's your release, Alyssa. We're restructuring the tech division, and frankly, your services are no longer required. Let's be completely honest with each other. You've had a good run here, but you're just a pretty face we used to pitch software to old board members. Now that the company is moving in a direction of real leadership, we need actual professionals running the show, not decorations." The words were designed to cut. They were designed to make me cry or scream or beg for my job. Instead, I just watched him. I noticed the way his fingers tapped nervously on the armrest. I noticed the desperate need for validation in his eyes. He wanted a performance. I refused to give him one. "I see," I said quietly. Austin took my silence as defeat. He leaned forward, his voice growing smugger by the second. "Don't worry, your access to the servers has already been cut. And before you think about trying anything foolish, let me remind you of something. The core code, the flagship cloud routing architecture, every single line of software you wrote under this roof is enterprise property now. It belongs to us. You walk out of here with nothing but your purse." I looked down at the paper, picked up my favorite silver pens, and signed my name at the bottom of the page. I didn't hesitate. I didn't argue. I simply slid the signed termination notice back across the polished table. I stood up, went to my desk, packed a single small cardboard box of personal belongings, and walked out of the glass tower. As the elevator descended to the parking garage, a cold smile spread across my face. Austin thought he had just cleared out overpaid dead weight. He thought he had successfully stolen the crown jewels of the company. What his staggering arrogance and sexism had blinded him to was a single, fatal detail. The entire cloud platform didn't run on standard software. It ran on a highly proprietary data-throttling patent valued at $85 million in our upcoming corporate buyout. A patent that was never signed over to Ethelgard Tech. It belonged completely to me, held under a temporary lease agreement that had a very specific clause. If I am ever fired without cause, the license dies instantly. Austin hadn't just fired an employee. He had just pulled the plug on his father's entire empire. I walked out into the bright morning sunlight of the parking lot, placed my cardboard box into the passenger seat of my car, and sat behind the wheel. I didn't start the engine right away. Instead, I just looked up at the 14th floor of the glass tower, watching the sunlight reflect off the windows. My phone suddenly buzzed in my hand. It was an email notification. The subject line read, "Urgent Separation Agreement and Severance Package." It was sent by the Director of Human Resources, but the metadata showed it had been drafted from Austin's office less than 10 minutes ago. I opened the attached document on my phone. The company was offering me a standard severance package, 3 months of salary, and extended healthcare benefits. It looked incredibly generous on the surface. But I have spent nearly 2 decades navigating the treacherous waters of corporate tech contracts. I didn't just read the bold bullet points. I scrolled straight down to the fine print at the very back of the document. There, hidden on page 7 under a section innocently titled Miscellaneous NDA Updates, was a trap. It was a retroactive intellectual property waiver clause written in dense, heavy legal language. If I signed that paper to get my 3 months of salary, I would be legally transferring all past, present, and future rights to any software, architecture, or patents created during my tenure directly to Ethelgard Tech. I let out a soft laugh in the quiet of my car. The corporate panic had already begun. Austin had let his ego make the decision to fire me. But the moment I walked out the door, the company's internal legal audit team must have looked at the acquisition files and realized a terrifying truth. They didn't actually own the foundational code for their flagship product. They were trying to clean up Austin's mess before anyone noticed, hoping I was stupid enough or desperate enough to sign away an $85 million asset for a few weeks of pay. I opened my personal laptop, connected it to my secure hotspot, and pulled up a private, encrypted digital vault. Inside was a document from 2018. It was the original system licensing contract I had signed with Arthur Croft, the old CEO and Austin's father. Back in 2018, the company was on the verge of total operational collapse. Their servers were failing under heavy traffic and they were losing major clients by the day. They had begged me to implement my proprietary data throttling algorithm to save them. Because they couldn't afford to buy the technology outright back then, I agreed to lease it to them. But I had my lawyer write a very specific ironclad protection clause into that contract. The clause stated that the patent license was strictly contingent upon my active employment. If Alyssa Cordell was ever separated from the company without a documented, board-approved cause, the lease would automatically terminate. The company would have exactly 60 minutes of custody before all rights instantly reverted to my exclusive personal control. I looked at the digital clock on my car dashboard. It was exactly 10:15 a.m. Austin had handed me my termination notice at 10 a.m. That meant the countdown was already running. The company had exactly 45 minutes left before they were running an $85 million platform on stolen technology. I ignored the frantic email from HR, left the fraudulent severance package completely unsigned, and dialed the number for my personal intellectual property attorney. The trap was set, and Austin had walked right into it. 30 minutes later, I walked into a quiet, high-rise office building downtown. I wasn't panicked. I didn't feel broken. I felt incredibly focused. I was meeting with Owen Cordell, my older brother, and a top-tier intellectual property attorney who had guided my legal strategy for over a decade. When I entered his office, he already had a glass of water waiting for me. He looked at my single cardboard box and shook his head with a grim smile. Austin actually did it, didn't he? Owen asked, pulling up my master file on his dual computer monitors. He did, I replied, sitting down and smoothing out my skirt. He called me just a pretty face, told me my services were no longer required, and cut my server access. He also claimed the core code belongs entirely to the enterprise. Owen let out a loud laugh that echoed against the office walls. Austin Croft might have an expensive MBA, but he clearly never learned how to read a basic balance sheet or a corporate asset registry. Let's look at the actual reality. Owen pulled up the specific documentation for my crown jewel, U.S. patent number 9412811. To a regular person, the technical title sounds boring. But in simple terms, it is a proprietary data throttling algorithm. Think of it like a hyper-intelligent digital traffic cop. When millions of people log into a cloud system at the exact same moment, the servers get overwhelmed and crash. My algorithm predicts these traffic spikes and automatically redistributes the data load in real time. It keeps the platform perfectly stable without losing a single millisecond of speed. It is the literal spine of Ethelgard Tech's entire operation. Every single product they sell relies on this algorithm to function. Back in 2018, the old CEO Arthur Croft knew that tech giants like Google and Microsoft were trying to hire me. He couldn't match their massive salaries, so we made a deal. I kept full personal ownership of the patent and I leased it to Ethelgard Tech under a highly specific operational agreement. Austin, who was busy failing out of his second business school at the time, never bothered to audit these legacy files when his father handed him the COO position. He simply assumed that because I wrote the code while sitting in an Ethelgard office, the company owned it automatically. Owen checked the clock on his wall. It was exactly 11:01 a.m. The 60-minute grace period has officially expired, Alyssa. You received no board-approved cause for termination, and you did not sign their fraudulent severance waiver. The lease is dead. File it, I said quietly. With a single click of his mouse, Owen submitted our formal revocation of license directly to the Federal Patent Office. The legal reality was now set in stone. Ethelgard Tech no longer had any legal right to run a single line of my core architecture. But we didn't stop there. Instead of sending the compliance notice to Austin, who would probably just ignore it or hide it, I had Owen send a certified courtesy copy directly to every single member of the corporate board of directors. I wanted the news to drop straight into the laps of the people who actually had their money tied up in the company. Austin had wanted a clean, quiet exit for the woman he underestimated. Instead, I had just lit a fuse under the entire corporate boardroom. For the next 48 hours, I executed a strategy of absolute, calculated silence. In the modern corporate world, people think that shouting the loudest means you are winning. They are wrong. Silence is the most terrifying weapon you can use against an arrogant enemy because it leaves them completely blind to what is coming. While I stayed quietly inside my home office, Austin was living in a fantasy world of his own making. Through my industry contacts, I learned that he was preparing a massive nationwide press release. Ethelgard Tech was on the absolute verge of being acquired by the Vanguard Group, one of the largest private equity firms in the country. The acquisition deal was valued at a staggering $350 million. Austin's entire career, his reputation, and his dream of becoming a legendary tech executive rested entirely on this buyout going through cleanly. He had already scheduled a massive celebratory dinner with the Vanguard partners for the end of the week. But while Austin was busy picking out expensive champagne, I was quietly loading my legal weapon. First, I reached out to my former core engineering team. I didn't use my corporate email, which had been locked down. I called them directly on their personal phones. They were completely furious and demoralized by my sudden disappearance. They told me the office felt toxic and that Austin had already threatened to cut their bonuses to maximize the company's short-term profit margins before the sale. "Don't panic and don't quit," I told my lead engineer David, "and whatever you do, do not sabotage the system. Just do your jobs exactly by the book, but I need you to do one thing for me. Every single time the system throws a validation error or a data latency log, document it standardly in the official system registry. Do not patch it manually. Just log it." David understood exactly what I was implying. Without my encryption keys running in the background, the system would naturally begin to destabilize. Next, I took the most devastating step. Owen and I drafted an official, certified legal notice of copyright infringement and intellectual property deficiency. We didn't send it to Ethelgard. We bypassed them entirely and sent it directly to the lead acquisition lawyers representing the Vanguard Group. The letter was simple, clear, and written in plain English so that any financial auditor could understand it instantly. It laid out the undeniable proof that Ethelgard Tech was currently attempting to sell a software platform that they did not legally own. We attached the original 2018 lease agreement, the federal patent registration under my name, and the official timestamp of my groundless termination. By Wednesday afternoon, my phone began to buzz continuously. The caller ID showed the corporate headquarters of Ethelgard Tech. First came a call from the director of HR. Then 3 calls from Austin's personal assistant. Then finally, Austin's name popped up on my screen 4 times in a row. They had finally realized that I hadn't signed the severance agreement, and their internal legal team was likely starting to sweat. I didn't answer a single call. I let every single one go straight to voicemail. I sat on my balcony, sipping a warm cup of tea, watching the sun set over the city. When an arrogant man thinks he has completely destroyed you, he expects you to beg, cry, or fight back immediately. When you give him total silence instead, he starts to question his own shadow. Austin thought he had put me in my place. In reality, he was standing in the middle of a massive financial minefield, and he was about to take his very first step. On Thursday morning, Austin decided to celebrate his victory before the ink on the contract was even dry. He called a mandatory, company-wide all-hands meeting. Because I was no longer an employee, I couldn't attend in person, but one of my former colleagues sent me a private link to the internal live stream. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking black coffee, and watched the broadcast on my laptop. Austin stood at the mahogany podium in the main auditorium. He looked incredibly smug, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit. Behind him, a massive digital screen displayed the logos of Ethelgard Tech and the Vanguard Group side by side, underneath the words, "A new era of growth. We are on the verge of completing a historic $350 million acquisition," Austin announced into the microphone, his voice echoing through the speakers. He smiled broadly, soaking in the polite applause from the crowd. "This deal is proof that our new management style is working. For too long, this company was held back by legacy employees who resisted modernization, people who thought they were irreplaceable just because they wrote some early code. But true leadership means clearing out the dead weight to maximize our short-term profit margins. We have streamlined our tech division, and the future has never been brighter. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow sip of coffee. He was talking about me, publicly mocking me in front of the entire company to make himself look like a corporate genius. He wanted everyone to believe that my departure was a tactical business decision, rather than a reckless, ego-driven mistake. But his moment of absolute glory lasted exactly 4 minutes. Right in the middle of his speech, Austin's personal smartphone, which was sitting on the podium right next to the microphone, began to buzz violently. The vibration hummed right through the audio system. Austin frowned, looked down at the screen, and visibly paled. I could see the color drain from his face even through the pixelated live stream. It was a call from the lead compliance officer at Vanguard Group. Austin nervously cleared his throat, picked up the phone, and stepped away from the podium. He whispered into the receiver for less than 30 seconds before his posture completely collapsed. Vanguard had just reviewed the official legal notice of intellectual property deficiency that my attorney had sent them. They didn't care about Austin's corporate speeches. They cared about their $350 million. They immediately triggered an emergency compliance audit and placed a hard, absolute freeze on the entire buyout deal until Ethelgard could prove they actually owned the software they were trying to sell. The live stream suddenly went black as someone in the tech booth panicked and cut the feed. 2 hours later, an email arrived in my personal inbox. It didn't contain an apology. Instead, it was a fierce, hostile cease and desist letter from Ethelgard's corporate legal team, sent on Austin's direct orders. The letter accused me of malicious corporate interference and extortion. It threatened to sue me into absolute bankruptcy if I did not immediately sign over my patent rights and drop my claims. Austin still truly believed he was the master of the board. He thought a scary legal letter would make a woman like me crumble. He didn't understand that you cannot threaten someone with a lawsuit when they hold the legal title to the very ground you are standing on. He had built his entire strategy on intimidation, hoping I would be too afraid of their massive legal resources to fight back. But I had spent years meticulously protecting my work, and I knew exactly how weak their position truly was. He was completely trapped, and he didn't even know it yet. By Friday morning, the legal dispute quickly transformed into a catastrophic operational nightmare. My proprietary data throttling patent wasn't just a passive piece of paper stored in a government archive. It was an active, living piece of software infrastructure. The entire cloud routing system required a secure validation token to function correctly. This token was hard-coded to ping an independent encryption key hosted on a private cloud server that I personally owned and paid for out of my own pocket. At exactly midnight, the temporary technical grace period built into my old 2018 lease agreement officially expired. My private server automatically stopped issuing the validation tokens. Without that digital permission slip, my data throttling algorithm completely shut down. Thanks to urgent text messages from David, my former lead engineer, I knew exactly what happened next inside room 402, the main corporate server room. It turned into a scene of absolute, unmitigated panic. The enterprise platform began throwing thousands of critical authentication errors every single second. Without the algorithm balancing the digital traffic, the servers began to choke under the massive weight of regular user activity. Major enterprise clients across the country suddenly experienced severe service slowdowns, data latency, and complete platform blackouts. Austin rushed into room 402, his tie undone and sweat dripping down his forehead. He screamed at the senior engineers, demanding they just patch the code and bypass my digital locks. He thought software engineering was like fixing a leaky pipe. He thought you could just slap some tape on it and move on. But David stood his ground. He looked at Austin with a pale, exhausted face and explained the brutal reality. "We can't just bypass it, Austin," David told him. "Alyssa's algorithm is the literal spine of the entire multi-tenant database. The system architecture is built completely around her patent. If we try to strip her code out manually, the entire system will destabilize. We will corrupt the database and permanently destroy millions of gigabytes of live client data. If we do that, the company is finished." Austin's father's company was now facing total systemic collapse, and no amount of executive status or family money could write a piece of code to fix it. The corporate phone lines were melting. Institutional clients, including 3 Fortune 500 companies, were calling every 2 minutes, threatening immediate multi-million-dollar lawsuits for breach of contract and service downtime. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my phone rang again. This time, I decided to answer it. "Alyssa," Austin's voice came through the speaker. The arrogant, smug tone he had used on Tuesday morning was completely gone. His voice was shaking, thin and desperate. He sounded like a terrified little boy, trapped in a room he couldn't control. "Alyssa, we are having a temporary technical glitch with the cloud platform. The engineers say it's related to your old access keys. I need you to come into the office immediately and restore the authentication tokens. We can discuss a consulting fee for your time." I sat in the quiet comfort of my home office, listening to his frantic breathing. "It isn't a glitch, Austin," I said, my voice completely smooth and ice-cold. "It's the reality of your new leadership. If you want to talk to me, call a formal meeting with the board of directors. I will see you in the boardroom tomorrow morning." I hung up the phone before he could speak another word, leaving him alone in the dark. The trap had completely closed around him, and the final confrontation was now unavoidable. He had no choice but to face me on my terms. The power had shifted completely, and tomorrow, the whole board would watch his ultimate downfall. On Saturday morning, at exactly 10 o'clock, I walked back through the front doors of Ethelgard Tech. I wasn't carrying a cardboard box this time. I was flanked by Owen and 2 junior attorneys from his firm, all carrying thick leather briefcases. The building felt completely different than it had on Tuesday. The bustling energy was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating dread that hung over the entire lobby. We took the elevator straight up to the 14th floor and entered the main boardroom. The room was packed to absolute capacity. Every single member of the corporate board of directors was seated around the massive mahogany table. At the head of the table sat Arthur Croft, the aging CEO and founder. He looked 10 years older than the last time I saw him, his hands visibly shaking as he tried to pour water into a glass. Next to him was Austin. Austin looked utterly ruined. His hair was messy, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and the arrogant smirk had been completely wiped off his face. On the giant high-definition video screens mounted to the wall, the senior partners of Vanguard Group watched the room in cold, unblinking silence. They had their own team of financial auditors sitting behind them, waiting for answers. The moment I sat down at the far end of the table, Austin tried to make one last, desperate stand. He slammed his fist onto the glass surface, his voice cracking with emotion. "This is a setup," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Board members, don't listen to a word she says. Alyssa is committing blatant corporate sabotage and extortion. She deliberately disabled our core infrastructure during an active acquisition phase to tank our stock price and force us into a corner. We should have her arrested right now." I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I simply opened my leather portfolio and pulled out 2 documents. I slid them across the polished table toward the board members. One was the original certified 2018 patent registration. The other was the core infrastructure lease agreement containing the self-executing separation clause. "I didn't disable your infrastructure, Austin," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the silent room. "You did. When you chose to terminate my employment without cause on Tuesday morning, you voluntarily terminated the legal lease for my proprietary data throttling algorithm. You had 60 minutes to negotiate a new lease or secure alternative technology. You chose to send a fraudulent severance package instead." Austin scoffed, looking around the room for support. "You were an employee. Everything you built belongs to Ethelgard. You're just trying to rewrite history because you're bitter about being let go. Is that right?" I asked quietly. I tapped the screen of my personal smartphone, which was resting in the middle of the table. I opened an audio file and pushed the volume to the maximum. A clear, crisp recording began to play through the boardroom speaker system. It was the exact audio from Tuesday morning. Austin's voice boomed through the room. "Let's be completely honest with each other. You've had a good run here, but you're just a pretty face we used to pitch software to old board members. Now that the company is moving in a direction of real leadership, we need actual professionals running the show, not decorations." The boardroom went completely frozen. The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur Croft put his face in his hands, letting out a low groan of utter defeat. The board members glared at Austin with pure fury. Suddenly, the lead attorney for Vanguard Group spoke up over the video link. His voice was sharp and clinical. "Mr. Croft, this acquisition is frozen. Your COO has committed gross executive misconduct, material misrepresentation of corporate assets, and exposed this entire venture to catastrophic legal liabilities. Vanguard Group will not purchase a stolen platform. Effective immediately, we are slashing our acquisition offer by exactly $85 million. The independent market valuation of Ms. Cordell's patent. Furthermore, Cordell is not given total satisfaction, and the IP lease is not fully resolved within the next 24 hours. Vanguard Group is withdrawing from the deal entirely." We will see you in court for fraud." The board members turned on Austin like a pack of starving wolves. His father looked down at the table, completely unable to meet his son's eyes. In his desperate attempt to look powerful, Austin had just stripped $85 million of value from his family's dynasty in front of the entire world. The corporate resolution that followed was swift, brutal, and entirely public. The board of directors didn't waste a single moment trying to protect Austin's feelings. While Austin sat frozen in his chair, the board chairman called for an emergency vote. Within less than 2 minutes, the board voted unanimously to terminate Austin Croft from his position as Chief Operating Officer effective immediately. Because he was fired for gross executive misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty, his corporate contract was voided, stripping him of every single penny of his stock options, bonuses, and severance benefits. He was walking away with absolutely nothing, but the purge didn't stop there. The board turned its attention to his father. Arthur Croft was quietly but firmly forced into immediate retirement from his role as Chief Executive Officer and stripped of his board seat. The remaining board members knew that the Croft family name was now toxic to Vanguard Group, and they needed to salvage the $350 million acquisition at any cost. To save the company from absolute bankruptcies and prevent the enterprise cloud platform from failing permanently, the board turned directly to me. They didn't slide a fraudulent severance package across the table this time. Instead, their corporate lawyers presented an entirely new contract that Owen and I had prepared the night before. The terms of the settlement were historic. First, Ethelgard Tech agreed to pay me a massive upfront cash settlement for material breach of contract and wrongful termination. Second, they agreed to a new long-term licensing agreement for my proprietary data throttling patent. Under this new lease, the company would pay my private firm a multi-million-dollar annual licensing fee just to keep the encryption keys active. But the crown jewel of the agreement was the final clause. I was granted a permanent independent seat on the corporate board of directors with absolute unilateral veto power over all technical operations, infrastructure architecture, and executive hiring within the technology division. I picked up my silver pen once again and signed the new agreement. With a single stroke of ink, I went from a dismissed employee to the most powerful individual inside the corporate structure of Ethelgard Tech. I held the absolute veto over the very executives who had tried to erase me. The moment my signature hit the paper, I nodded to David via a text message, and my private server restored the authentication tokens. Within seconds, the errors logs cleared, the platform stabilized, and the cloud architecture began running smoothly again. On Monday morning, I walked into the glass tower to officially claim my new office on the executive floor. The entire atmosphere of the building had changed. Employees stood in the hallways, whispering in hushed tones, looking at me with a profound sense of respect and awe. They knew exactly what had happened over the weekend. They knew that the quiet woman who spent years building the system had just dismantled a tech dynasty. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corner office, holding a fresh cup of tea. Down below in the parking lot, I watched a lonely figure walk out of the side doors of the building. It was Austin. He was holding a single cardboard box containing his desk items, the exact same image he had tried to create for me just a few days ago. He looked small, defeated, and entirely broken as he tossed the box into the back seat of his car and drove away into complete professional obscurity. My victory was clean, entirely legal, and absolute. Austin had thought he could use his corporate authority to diminish my worth and steal my life's work simply because he viewed me as nothing more than a pretty face. But in the modern world of technology, true power doesn't belong to the loudest voice in the room or the man with the most expensive suit. True power belongs to the person who builds the foundation, understands the architecture, and meticulously protects their intellectual property. Austin learned that lesson the hard way, and it cost him his family's empire.